welcome to this edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. A little later in the program, our reporter from right here at KVEO, valleycentral.com, Jorge Vela, is going to talk to us about something he learned about tenant rights for undocumented migrants. Looking forward to that. But first, let's get through some of the headlines making news across the border, beginning with U.S. Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, better known as ICE, has a new website that they are calling the worst of the worst. Now, each week they're sending out a newsletter with a list of undocumented migrants they've arrested for being convicted or accused of serious felonies. All the suspects are either in ICE custody or have already been deported. Among those recently caught are Carolino Rondon. He's from the Dominican Republic. He was arrested in Pennsylvania and charged with possession of nearly 3.5 pounds of fentanyl and a ghost gun. We're going to talk more with our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, about new reporting on fentanyl. But also caught from that website is Gilberto Zapata Ortiz, who's from Mexico. He was also arrested last week. He's been convicted of manslaughter in McLennan County, Texas. That's up near Waco. And then there's Javier Bernal Rosales. He's also from Mexico. He was arrested in Denver on charges of sexual assault of a child under 15, as well as drunk driving. In other news, as federal agents took part in a controversial immigration crackdown in Los Angeles last month, they were accompanied by TV personality Dr. Phil, and now he's facing some harsh criticism from talk show host and comedian Bill Maher. Now, on Maher's show on Friday night, he asked Dr. Phil why he was going on the ICE raids. He told him, for years, you've worked to put families together and heal, and now you're going on ICE raids with people who are literally separating families. Dr. Phil responded with, that's, quote, BS, end quote. Also happening is new reporting from the New York Times regarding cartels and the distribution of fentanyl. Our San Diego correspondent, Salvador Rivera, is here to fill us in on that reporting. Hey, Sal.
Rudy, how are you? This specifically deals with the Sinaloa cartel. At one point, perhaps the most powerful cartel in history. Of course, in recent years, its leadership has been arrested, extradited. Others are on the run, and this has weakened the Sinaloa cartel quite a bit. We have reported that the Sinaloa cartel has been losing territories, influence, power over the fentanyl, other drug, cocaine, methamphetamines, exporting of drugs to the United States. But this new article by the New York Times, reported by Paulina Villegas and Maria Abi Habib, they got really detailed. They got unprecedented access into the Sinaloa cartel about its operations into the exportation of fentanyl. And we've learned that while it is diminishing in its power and influence, the Sinaloa cartel is still very much in business in the production of pills like these, of fentanyl, and then exporting them to the U.S. over a very elaborate system. We have learned, according to this article in the New York Times, that the cartel has decided to export smaller quantities of fentanyl to avoid detection. And what they're doing is that they are using people such as a man who is a mechanic by day, but he is a drug packer by night, as described in this New York Times article. And what he is doing, he has come up with a system to wrap the drugs in this like aluminum containers, and then he sprays them with bleach so the dogs can't sniff the drugs and they can go across the border easily. Now, the mechanic turned drug packer was also saying that once he is done with the packing in elaborate ways, he says he rarely uses the same place in the car more than once. And he says he's using cars such as Hondas, Nissans, Toyotas, very average vehicles to avoid detection or avoid some sort of suspicion. And now he was also saying, and others within the Sinaloa cartel, because the reporters featured 5 people within the cartel who were explaining how they're doing it. And one of the ways that they're doing it, once they pack the vehicles, they send them from Sinaloa, from the city of Culiacan on the west coast of Mexico, and then they go all the way up to Arizona, to either Nogales or San Luis Rio Colorado, the ports of entry right there. And all along the way, the car that is loaded by drugs is escorted by lookouts and people who are kind of jumping ahead to make sure that there are not roadblocks. The Mexican army is not in the way. So these people are obviously in front. They're lookouts, they're guides to make sure that the drugs or the car with the drugs gets as far as the border crossing. At that point, according to the article and according to the Sinaloa cartel people who spoke with the reporters, there are ICE agents, I'm sorry, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers at the ports of entry who are on the take. They are getting up to $40,000 per load to allow these cars into the U.S. without being inspected. And that's how they're getting the drugs into the U.S. So this is what's happening. The Sinaloa cartel still very much in business, according to the New York Times article. Now, we're also hearing when it comes to fentanyl, according to the FBI, that drug seizures, fentanyl seizures, are up since President Trump took office. The Kash Patel, the director of the FBI, is saying that fentanyl seizures are up by 200%. I'm sorry, by 25% since President Trump took office about 25 days ago. Now, he also alluded to a report, another story in the New York Times about a secret agreement, a secret order coming from the White House to use Department of Defense personnel, the military, to strike the cartels in Mexico, use military force against the cartels in Mexico. Of course, this is still has not been confirmed by anybody within the White House, but this is according to a New York Times story. Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has said that she would not stand for this, and this will not happen. She's not expecting and will not allow the military to operate in Mexico, Rudy. But if you are familiar with movies, the way I am, there's a movie that with Harrison Ford a long time ago, Clear and Present Danger.
Mhm.
And in it, they showed how the military, using covert actions, could strike cartels, could blow up labs and interfere with their operations. Of course, it is Hollywood, but it's still very much in the scope of what we could see if this order is very much true, and we do see some sort of military operation south of the border against cartels.
Now, I know that is one thing that a lot of folks over the past, decade especially have been pushing for is for the designation of cartels as a foreign terrorist organization. And that kind of opens up the federal government to take those kinds of actions, correct?
Correct. That is, in fact, what happened. But they can also seize your assets. They can also go after people who they perceive or who have evidence of working with cartels. So if you happen to rent a truck to a cartel member, they can come after you. If you launder money unknowingly for a cartel, they can come after you. So by being designated as a terrorist organization, they can go after people who have worked with willingly or unwillingly with a cartel. And apparently this is happening because according to the U.S. Attorney's Office, especially here in San Diego, they are being going after a lot of people accused of money laundering or aiding and abetting drug cartels in Mexico.
As far as the cars, you mentioned they were just kind of low profile, not very not standing out. It's cars like Toyotas, Hondas. Are those cars, has there been any connection, do you know, maybe to the US, or like those cars being stolen from the US and taken down there like we just talked about a couple weeks ago?
I'm guessing eventually, or they were in the U.S. at one point, and then they're taken down to Mexico, and they're sold down there, registered in Mexico, so they don't. Because if you drive a car across the border and it's stolen, it could lend or force officers to stop you. But this is just nondescript, very average vehicles, as opposed to maybe some fancy pickup truck, a Hummer, big, fancy, expensive Jeep sort of. So they're going out of their way to use very low descript, low profile vehicles in this operations.
Now, we know that the human smuggling numbers, the numbers that we've been reporting from encounters in between the ports of entry for folks trying to get across without permission, those numbers are dropping. Do you see the fentanyl increasing to make up for the money lost in the cartels?
Well, you would think that's what's happening, but if you believe what we're reading from U.S. authorities, they're saying that the number of fentanyl coming into the U.S. has decreased while seizures are up. This could be, in fact, the case, but as the New York Times article that I've been talking about said, the drug cartels are saying, or the people involved with the drug cartels are saying, if we don't do it, if you stop us, someone else is going to step up and they're going to continue. They don't see an end to fentanyl or cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, other drugs going north of the border until the demand in the U.S. slows down or plummets. So as long as there's demand in the U.S., someone is going to try to supply the drug to people who are addicted or who use them recreationally.
Yeah, basic market principles there when it comes to the
Mm-hmm.
drug usage here in America. Well, thank you so much for your reporting on that. Salvador Rivera, our San Diego correspondent, joining us on that. Now, coming up next, we have our ValleyCentral.com reporter, Jorge Vela, here in Harlingen, Texas, to talk about something that has been popping up around here in the Rio Grande Valley, and that is what rights do migrants that are undocumented have as tenants? We're going to hear from him right after the break. Border Report Live is back in 1 minute. And welcome back to this Monday edition of Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mideles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in Deep South Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. And joining me, speaking of the Rio Grande Valley, we have ValleyCentral.com, KVEO, and Harlingen reporter Jorge Vela joining us today to talk about something pretty interesting. It's, Jorge, it's something that a lot of folks haven't really thought about. We talk about the border here on this program every single day. We're talking about things like cartel violence. We're talking about ICE raids. But something that we haven't been talking about is the housing situation for a lot of these undocumented individuals here in the country. So go ahead and fill us in on some of the reporting that you've been doing on this subject.
Definitely. I mean, this is an important topic that as I was doing another news story on immigration, I heard two attorneys talk about how this lady came up to them and said, hey, as a landlord, will I get in trouble if somebody is undocumented and I'm renting out my apartment? And so I thought, you know what, that's an important topic to definitely go into. And basically, I mean, the legal status doesn't really matter when it comes to tenants. As you can see, it doesn't become harboring unless somebody's concealing the person and they actively know that they're not here legally, they're not giving them rent, or they're doing favors in exchange for living there or providing shelter. So I did spoke to attorney Alex Martinez about the issue. He did provide some information as to what is the law in this problem. And please take a look at what he said.
The tenant's rights don't say the tenant's rights are suspended if the person is an undocumented immigrant. It does not work like that. The Fair Housing Act specifically, intentionally leaves out a person's legal status in this country. If they evict a person without following the proper legal requirements, then those tenants have recourse. They can file suit for breach of contract, and they can go to a small claims court, to a justice of the peace, and they don't need an attorney, and the judge will go ahead and give them restitution.
Now, Jorge, as someone who has a real estate background, it's been the family business for a long time. One of the things that you just heard there is that they have the same rights as any tenant. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, basically they have all the same equal rights. Even if evicted, they have the same rights to appeal or to get a formal eviction notice, which was really interesting to know. But especially he did say that if they're undocumented and they have something bad going on at their home, they can actually report that to the landlord and they should get fixed as it is by the law. So pretty much they have the same equal rights when it comes to living and everything. And also, like he said, I mean, landlords don't do E-Verify or any of those system immigration checks. And it's not their job to check who's legal and who's not legal. As long as they get somebody who rents out their place, their dues are paid, then they should be able to stay. And he also said that, I mean, it's the clear answer is no, because, I mean, people can't stay there and live there. But he did also mention there's certain gray areas, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky. There's some cases where prosecutors say somebody's harboring or there's a landlord harboring people. And those gray areas, he did talk a little bit about that. So take a listen, and then we'll take it from there.
A lot of the times it can be misunderstood. Say, for example, a person was behind on rent, and but there was never an agreement that the rent was going to be waived, that there was going to be free rent. And there they could present charges saying, well, you're harboring individuals, you're letting them stay here. It is not a landlord-tenant relationship.
You know, what's really interesting about that, Jorge, is that Salvador Rivera, San Diego correspondent, and I were kind of touched on it just very briefly in the first segment, and that was what happens if someone's labeled a terrorist organization, in this case, the cartel organizations, and that gives the federal government the ability to come after everyone involved, right? So as I think Salvador had mentioned, something like if you're aiding or abetting, if you're laundering money, would this kind of fall under that kind of catch-all when it comes to gray areas?
Exactly. And that's some of the big fears that landlords have, that they might be trapped, or if they find a large group of people living there, that they might be liable, or they might be also charged because of that. According to Martinez, if there's a real tenant-landlord relationship, that means there's emails, there's the receipts, there's notices that the rent is being paid, then that does not, the landlord is not liable for any of that, because they have a relationship just between landlord and tenant. That means they're paying rent, and they can live however they want to live, as long as they respect the property, as long as they respect neighbors and any other rules that the landlord might have. So that really takes away any responsibility. But it does become a gray area if, let's say, for example, a tenant cannot pay rent for a certain month, and he goes to the landlord and tells him, hey, you know what, let me do some yard work, let me do some work around the area, and that way, I mean, you can let rent go for this month. That is when it becomes a little bit gray area, because the landlord is not behaving in a way that is under the Fair Housing Act. They're doing they're in a way taking advantage, as Martinez said, of their status, and also using them to do that. And that is where prosecutors can come in and maybe even put charges on them if they do try to, in a certain way, abuse. But like Martinez said, I mean, as long as the people are paying the rent, they're paying their dues, they don't have much to worry about, because that relationship is really settled. And he also added that landlords should always keep receipts, emails, notices, and everything, just to verify that relationship. And if ever anything happens in their property, they have that established for the authorities. As for the...
Well, I was going to say, so just an interesting note on that. I've actually seen a landlord go through that very thing. When I first moved back down here to the Rio Grande Valley in 2018 or 2019 rather, and started reporting here locally, you know, I think it was actually in the first week on the job as a TV reporter, the very first week, I did a story with a landlord who he found out he was accidentally harboring undocumented migrants because ICE raided one of his rental units, and he had no clue. He said that he had rented to just one individual. They never said anything, and if you had been in this place when I walked in there, you could tell that there wasn't much room for more than another individual. But I think it ended up being 18 individuals were locked in there. But what got him, you know, off the hook, because that was his big concern. What had gotten him off the hook is exactly what you just said, is keeping those documents, keeping the information of the individual renter that had signed up. And in that case, it was most likely someone involved in the smuggling process who had done that. But I just remember hearing from that landlord, and you could hear his voice trembling and his hands were shaking as we were discussing it. He was afraid. We actually, you know, hid his face and made him anonymous because he was afraid for both sides. You know, he was afraid to be prosecuted by the law, and on the flip side, he was afraid from whoever got those, you know, 18 people in his house. Like, what does that turn into? So he was pretty worried, you know, on both ends from this situation.
Exactly, and that's one of the main reasons for this story. I mean, many landlords are worried right now where they stand, especially with the whole immigration crackdown, and they really want to have a foundation, and they want to feel safe that they could rent their property, or if they're not going to have any issues. Now, another issue Martinez did talk about was that some people were one area where tenants might not have a complete right or a complete way to fight that is if the landlord is threatening them to call ICE or
So yeah,
something like that.
and I was going to ask you that because you had mentioned, Attorney Martinez had mentioned rather that, any kind of abuse of authority in that situation falls under the Fair Housing Act. But what happens when, I want to juice the rent up by $200 this month and you have no choice or else I'm calling ICE? Is that something that's allowable?
Unfortunately, it is. Unfortunately, the tenant, if they don't have an illegal status, and they might worry that ICE or any other federal immigration authorities might be calling on them. Let's check a little bit about what he said about that issue, and then we'll talk about it.
Basically, find a place where you're not being treated like that. But the mere comment, the mere saying, we're going to call ICE, that in and of itself does not create any type of recourse to go do anything about that. They shouldn't be doing it, but if they say it, it's not like the tenant is going to enjoy of a penalty placed on them.
So Martinez puts it in the way that, let's say the tenant does call ICE, even though the landlord calls ICE, even though the tenant might try to do something in court against that. I mean, they're still going to be processed by immigration. They're going to go through an immigration judge. They're going to go through the whole process and potentially be deported. So they don't really have any recourse when it comes to that. They must, like he said, find another place or where they might feel more comfortable. And that is an unfortunate thing that he said could be happening right now as tenants, as landlords find a way to get off the hook, like you said, and it's an issue. But when it comes to the basic rights, when it comes to renting, eviction notices and all that, tenants do have the same rights as any other tenant who has legal status or is a U.S. citizen.
I know you kind of touched on it at the beginning, but one question I had was, does an undocumented person have to tell their landlord that they're undocumented?
And no, they don't have to. They don't have to. Some apartment complexes do ask for Social Security, and I did ask Martinez about that. He said it's more to follow if they leave any bad damage in the property to report it to the credit bureau and stuff like that. But when it comes to renting out, they don't have to say if they're here legally or not. As long as they pay the rent, they show any other information that the property requires, they should be good to go. And
go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
And it becomes concealing only when the landlord tries to provide them shelter for free and use them as a way to take advantage and get them to do small jobs around the area of the property.
Now, going back to that asking, I can't pay my rent. Now, if you're a landlord and you come to me and you suggest, hey, well, you can't pay rent this month. I have some odd jobs that you can take care of around the unit or around the complex or some of my other properties. And I agree that's a no-go, right? Because it was initiated by the landlord. But let's say I can't make rent. You're my landlord, and I come up to you and I said, hey, Mr. Jorge, I'm not going to be able to make rent. Let me do some work for you. Even that's not allowed.
No, it's not. The way Martinez said is if the tenant ever has an issue in paying rent, they might ask for an extension or something like that. Mm-hmm. But again, the landlord should provide a formal letter, a formal statement, or anything that is formal as a way to show that, hey, rent is going to be extended. You have an extra month for 2 weeks to pay your rent. But here's the formal notice that, hey, rent is due at this deadline. As long as that deadline is completed by then the tenant-landlord relationship is well established.
And just, one last, it's more of a commentary than it is a question, going back to having a landlord report you to ICE, that kind of begs the question, if I'm an ICE agent at least, that begs the question, how long have you known this person was in the country without permission? Was there any thoughts on that from Mr. Martinez?
That's a good question. Martinez did talk a little bit about that, and he did say that the only way they can prove if the landlord knew, because they don't have to check, there's no system to check. The only way is if they have any relationship that isn't within the rules of a tenant landlord. Let's say, for example, they didn't charge rent for the first month, for this a couple of months, then that's where charges might be applied by federal authorities. But as long as there's a clear, hey, this person got into this apartment at this certain date, this person started living and paying rent at this certain date, then everything should be fine. And he, like Martinez said, as long as the paperwork is there, then landlords shouldn't fear anything, and the tenants should always exercise their rights as tenants and as long as they're paying their rent at all times.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your reporting, Jorge Vela from valleycentral.com here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley. Stick around. We got one more story to tell you about when Border Report Live comes back in 1 minute. And welcome back to Border Report Live. My name is Rudy Mireles, and I am your host here in Harlingen, Texas, in the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem pledged to continue ICE raids in so-called sanctuary cities. She spent Friday near Chicago, where she accused local Democrats of protecting undocumented immigrants in the Windy City, and they're calling it a publicity stunt. Our Washington correspondent, Raquel Martin, has the latest.
We will defend the homeland.
It's the unequivocal message the Trump administration is sending to every so-called sanctuary city. Friday, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem blasted Chicago area Democrats, accusing them of shielding criminal migrants from ICE raids.
Our federal officers have had to do this alone without their support.
Within minutes, Chicago Democrats fired back on a press call.
They can lie, but the truth and the law are on our side.
Illinois Congressman Chuy Garcia says non-criminals and families are being swept up by raids. In a letter to the Trump administration, Illinois Democrats accused DHS of using illegal tactics to undermine local laws.
Local policies that build trust between police and keep communities safe.
It's the latest scuffle over the president's mass deportation plans. This week, just across the border in Indiana, the Trump administration announced its next alligator Alcatraz is in the works. Its name, however, the Speedway Slammer, sparked pushback, including from IndyCar.
I wasn't involved in that.
Border Czar Tom Homan says they're adding 1,000 beds to the detention center thanks to new funding from the Big Beautiful Bill.
Every bed we bring on, we fill pretty quickly.
Homan is praising red states willing to house a surge in detainees.
I would like to see bigger facilities that be more efficient, holding several thousand people. But 1,000-bed facility is a great help.
In Washington, Raquel Martin.